Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I welcome you today to our dialogue on gender and climate change in Africa. But today we'll be dialoguing about gender and climate justice with a special focus in Kenya. Today's dialogue was jointly co-hosted by the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, which is a nonprofit German foundation, and in collaboration with the Inclusive Climate Change Adaptation for Sustainable Africa. My name is Dr. Mary Nyasimi, and I'm the Executive Director of ICCASA, and I do welcome everyone to participate actively in today's dialogue. As usual, please note that the dialogue, today's dialogue will be about an hour and a half, and I please hope everyone will be patient enough and participate actively. And please note that it will be recorded. The dialogue is also streaming on ICCASA YouTube channel, and we do encourage you to tweet aggressively as we go along during this dialogue with the hashtag gender and climate conversations. Today we have the pleasure of having 3 speakers instead of 1. We will be discussing issues of gender and climate justice in Kenya. I politely remind everyone to be posting their question on the chat box, and they will be answered as we go along during the dialogue. At this juncture, I would like to welcome our co-host, Robert Mudama, to just give a few remarks. Robert, please welcome.
Thanks a lot, Mary Nyasimi, and good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. My name is Robert Mudami. I work with the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung as a program coordinator. On behalf of the country director, FES Kenya, Bastian Schulz, let me first thank the Inclusive Climate Change Adaptation for Sustainable Africa for accepting to partner with us in a series of dialogues around gender justice and climate change. As FES, we working on gender justice with respect to 2 pathways. And we decided to narrow down on what this really means within the climate change context. And of course, climate change has a huge implication on men and women, young people, affecting them differently based on the kind of responsibilities and the tasks that they do. But looking from the gender justice lens, this delves down into addressing the inequalities that both genders face. And for example, if you look at specific sectors, for example, how women also tap into jobs, for example, in the energy sector, the agricultural sector, and how the climate change comes in within the different sectors, then we have to see then what are the skills, for example, that women require, what are the challenges that men and women face in trying to tap into those jobs that come with addressing climate change with respect to the adaptation and mitigation aspect. So currently we are undertaking a discussion paper on pathways for pursuing gender justice in the implementation of the NDC, that is the National Determined Contribution, and with a focus on the agricultural sector. And I'm sure once we are done with this, with ICCASA, we'll be able to have a follow-up discussion in trying to look at, for example, in a specific sector, how do we address the gender justice component? So thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion, and I hope the speakers will bring out the different issues within the gender justice aspect with respect to climate change. Then we will see then how we proceed from there. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Robert, for that brief highlight about gender and climate justice. So now we are ready to go on to listen to what our speakers, the 3 speakers for today, are going to discuss. Our first speaker is Josephat Ireli. Josephat Ireli works at the State Department of Gender in the Ministry of Public Service and Gender in Kenya. And he's a gender specialist and has expertise in gender and climate change. Welcome, Mr. Josephat.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mudami. Thank
Mr.
you.
Josephat, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mary? Hello, Mary, can you hear me?
You're audible, Josephat. Can hear you.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
You can?
Yes, we can hear you, but you're dragging a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Mary. I hope it is the network will let us go through this. So thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mudami. Thank you, our ICCASA Africa, and the co-presenters and those who are listening in. My name, as has been stated, is Joseph Tireri, and I'll take you through this afternoon about on the issues of tackling the triple injustice of climate change, gender inequality, and social exclusion in Kenya. So that will be our discussion. Next. And as we open up this discussion, I want to start with a quote that was given in 2018 by Tony Broder, UN Women Deputy Representative, I think in Latin America, during a discussion about issues of gender and climate change. And it says, too often, gender is not seen as a core development priority or critical to the success of climate change adaptation. The Sustainable Development Goals highlight gender as a key priority, and we hope that by using a gender lens in adaptation planning, we can assess the different needs of men, women, girls, and boys to unlock their fullest potential. So this is important in our discussion today, but also in the future in the light of unlocking the issues of climate and gender justice, not just in Kenya, but internationally. So this quote is important to inform our discussions today and what is happening in Kenya and the omissions that they are in our implementation programs and plans. Next. Next. So for us to travel this journey together, it is important to link the three concepts together. That is climate change, gender inequality, and social exclusion. And we must therefore use the concept of intersectionality, which is a framework for looking at a person, a group of people, or a social problem as affected by a number of discriminations or disadvantages. So it takes into intersection takes into account our or people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand the complexity of prejudices they face, including discrimination, exclusion, and inequality. So in this particular context, we want to look in terms of the intersectionality. We want to look at a person meeting multiple intersecting and overlapping issues that affect their lives, so that you are not just a woman, you could be a poor woman, you could be a poor woman who is also having a disability, you could be also a poor woman who is a minority or marginalized, and the same thing happens, could be for men. You are not just a man, you are an older man, you are a younger man, or you are middle-aged, but you're also having a disability. You are also left out in the discussions, you don't have a voice, and so on. So intersection is about all these things coming together to inform our ability to participate in climate change action from a gender perspective, and also looking at the issue of exclusion. And we are going to explore this concept as we move forward. Next. Next slide. So intersection, okay, back a bit. So intersectionality in the face of climate change, we understand that this phenomenon threatens to erode human freedoms that have already been realized, but also inhibits freedoms that could be realized but which have been provided for in our constitutions and our laws, but it also limits the choices that we make as men and women, boys and girls, based on issues like that gender inequality intersects very inextricably with the climate risks and vulnerabilities and with social exclusion. And we are going to explore what social exclusion means for us in Kenya and the implication for national development, and about people, stakeholders being involved and how they are excluded and included in national development. So for example, when we talk about intersectionality, climate change, we need to understand that women's limited access to resources, and this is well documented, not just in Kenya, but internationally, and also their restricted rights and their limited mobility because of social norms and cultural inhibitions, and their muted voices in shaping decisions make them highly vulnerable to climate change. So even as we talk about gender, we're looking at an aspect of gender or a category of gender who are women who do not share the same advantages, whether political, social, religious, or cultural, with the men. So that forms a critical aspect of what we call not just gender inequality, but social exclusion. So the nature of that vulnerability will vary widely, therefore cautioning us against generalization about just gender, about certain categories, but also, sorry, please, but climate. Okay. We therefore need to put social exclusion, not just inclusion, into context. Let's move on into context. I wanted to quote the 2007 Human Development Report, but let's move on to the next slide. Having linked intersectionality within the three concepts of climate change, gender, social exclusion, then we need to define in our context, Kenya, what social exclusion means. For me, or in this discussion, and out of this discussion, social exclusion is not necessarily the opposite of social inclusion, because sometimes when we look at inclusion, we look at our people provided as a category of people, or a category of women, they provided the platform to participate, but without going down to break it down. What women? Is it rich women? Is it poor women? Is it politically correct women? Is it women or rural women, urban women, and so on? So when we look at social exclusion, we use the we look at it multidimensionally for us to understand that it is not exactly the opposite of inclusion. It is about when we do inclusion, who is left out and what are the reasons for leaving them out, even when we provide for inclusion in national development programs and plans, or even in laws. So social exclusion is a multidimensional phenomenon, not limited to material deprivation, as is normally looked at, but we look, for example, poverty is an important dimension of exclusion, albeit only one dimension. Therefore, accordingly, social inclusion processes involve more than improving access to economic resources, because they also describe the political, the social, the religious, the cultural, and so on. Social exclusion also describes a state in which individuals are unable to participate fully in economic, social, political, and cultural life, as well as the processes leading to and sustaining such a state. And this is important for us. It is not just the state, but what are those processes that lead to that situation? But importantly also, what are those situations that lead to sustaining them as a state? So also exclusion, social exclusion entails not only material deprivation again, but also lack of agency or control over important decisions, as well as feelings of alienation and inferiority. Therefore, age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, religion, migration status, socioeconomic status, place of residence, sexual orientation, and gender identity have been grounds for social exclusion over time. On the other hand, for us to understand and contrast, social inclusion is defined as a process of improving the terms of participation in society, particularly for people who are disadvantaged, through enhancing opportunities, access to resources, voice, and respect for rights in Kenya. So as we proceed, we will see what Kenya has done through certain critical instruments to put the concept of social inclusion and also to address the issue of social exclusion into our development process. Next. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Then gender differences in access to and control over resources also shape men's and women's ability to adapt new strategies, practices, or technologies. Okay, please, not so fast. Hello, previous slide, please. Previous slide. Okay. Gender differences in access to and control over resources also shape men and women's ability to adopt new strategies, practices, or technologies in response to climate change. And as we navigate through this, we will see that the issues of technology adoption, for example, is not just availability or accessibility, it's also about information, awareness, and affordability for women, and also the questioning of what benefits they bring. So that is a gender difference that's about the access and the control. And control is much more important than access for us in this forum. So in Kenya, for example, men tend to control income from agricultural production and have greater control over resources needed to adapt new technologies. And we understand that women own only 1% of land in Kenya and only 7% of the property in the Republic. So it tells us the level to which they are able to control income and also to influence decisions against those incomes or against the assets that are held by the society. So social norms for us are important in Kenya to address how they limit the adaptation options that are available to women, for example, and where women may have less mobility, which is in many communities in Kenya, which is the case, and this may limit the ability to access local markets that are related to what they produce and which influence climate change adaptation mechanisms, but also seeking outside employment opportunities because of the limitations to their mobility. Again, social norms discourage women from adopting particular technologies and practices, such as agroforestry and certain types of cash crops, because cash crops are linked to the ownership of the farms or the land by men. So they are restricted on what they can grow on the land. So they have a power to access, but not the power to control what goes in and what goes out of those farms and lands. Thank you. Next. Next slide. Then the critical question we ask as we have this decision is why gender and inclusion in climate change action in Kenya? One, as we have already alluded, is that we have differentiated impacts of any action in the climate change that we undertake. And we have mentioned that women have less access to resources that should necessarily enhance their capacity to adapt to climate change, including what we have called land, credit, education, therefore making them less vulnerable. That should make them less vulnerable. And we know also credit, for example, and a very critical empowerment tool is limited for women because in most credit giving instrument, there is the issue of collateral, to provide collateral. And usually it's the issue of, for example, having the documents for land, which are held mainly by men, also by property certificates. But also vulnerability here for us depends in large part on access and control over these resources. We have said, we have mentioned it. Then gender equality for us in Kenya will intersect with climate risks and vulnerability. This is well captured in the Human Development Report 2007. In Kenya, as elsewhere in the world, it is widely acknowledged that the negative effects of climate change are likely to hit the poor or the poorest most. And information available is that 60% of the world's poorest 1 billion people are women and girls. And to add to this, for example, in the case of Kenya, in wage employment, information available tells us for every 100 shillings earned by men, women only earn 68 shillings for the same work, for the same job, covering the same period of time. So we have issues that we need to discuss in climate change that are being addressed by various policies that we are going to look at as we navigate this presentation. Next. So universally, and this also applies to Kenya, gender inequalities that limit women's access to financial resources, we have talked about it, and those land, education, health, and rights and other parameters also limit their capacity for coping with adapting to climate change impacts. So therefore, the unequal participation in decision-making processes and labor markets in Kenya further compound. We are talking about an existing inequality, which is further compounded by these inequalities that are newly created. So we can have an initial inequality that has been put in place by tradition and customs, but these inequalities can be excavated by the processes that we put in place, including in the market, in the labor market, and also the market for our produce. So they compound existing and sometimes create new inequalities, even as we try to put in intervention measures. So what we need to do is also to look out in Kenya, even within these policies, what is it that we could have put in place that can introduce new inequalities and also further lead to exclusion or social exclusion of the already excluded groups. Next. Across the developing world, Kenya included, women's leadership in natural resource management is well recognized, though largely unappreciated and less valued. And this is a key point for us in Kenya, and we are learning from countries that have advanced this. That we have seen where women have taken leadership because they have something to lose if they don't participate. So once they get this leadership in resource-related management programs, then we are able to get good results. But we are saying because of the social, the customary and cultural aspects and norms, then their work is less valued and appreciated. And this can be demonstrated by what we consider in our GDP, or gross domestic product, that calculates or looks at what is produced nationally, maybe by the plantations, by cash crops, by our farms, by our factories, by our industries, which are mainly owned and operated by men. So what goes into our GDP also ignores what we call the care economy, the work that women do out there, which is not documented in our national development instruments as recognizable, as valued, and as valuable. Yeah. So through those experiences that women have gone through, they have acquired valuable knowledge that will allow them to contribute positively to identification of appropriate adaptation and mitigation techniques, if only they are given the opportunity in climate change actions and implementation of programs and projects that are aligned to climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. So this is key for us going forward, but already some of our documents that we're going to look at have considered this, but the question is it being done to fulfillment? Next. We can move to the next one. This is just about a continuum of what we do in terms of promoting gender issues at the different levels. So some of the challenges we face in Kenya in integrating gender into climate, mainstreaming gender into climate change, and therefore mitigating against social exclusion. One of the challenges include that we have a problem generally of establishing a criteria to determine who is excluded and what ways is key to track progress, assess the impacts of measures that are taken to promote inclusion, and ultimately ensure that no one is left behind. Yet, quantifying social exclusion presents considerable challenges for us because data or indicators or tools to capture these are not in place. Again, inadequate gender data in programming and project implementation, telling us number of women, not just number of women and men, boys and girls, but the categories within those genders. What categories within women? Because women are not homogeneous. What categories among men? We don't have this, and where we have it very basically. Then we also have inadequate data quantifying participation of excluded groups, particularly women and minority groups in national development, including the value of the care economy, which we have mentioned. Again, there is limited access to productive resources by women and young people, which limits their role in decision-making, considering that productive resources are a factor of climate change. Again, limited training needs assessment. In most of the programs, this is not captured, although most of our documents nationally generated, in regard to climate change, including the act, the policies, the frameworks, talk about training needs assessments, so that they can actually quantify and also break down the capacity required, the categories even within the group of women, categories within the group of men, categories within the youth who require technical capacity building. So we also have capacity gaps for technical experts in and advocates for gender issues in terms of climate change, gender, and social exclusion. Again, we have inadequate technology needs assessment, and this was brought out when Kenya was developing the national guidance for mainstreaming gender into climate change actions, which is being finalized next. So that needs to be done so that adoption of technologies can be aligned to awareness of what it is and about the cost, about the affordability, and finally, why it should be adopted, which means the benefits that would accrue to it. So, but we have opportunities. Even as we have these documents, we still have open opportunities which are in our legal and policy frameworks. For instance, public participation in the counties in Kenya is entrenched in the Constitution and is envisaged to promote stakeholder participation, decision-making, and accountability. Yes, this is available, but then the critical issue is, even when public participation is provided for, who participates? Is it the physical participation? Is it the intellectual participation? Is it just women, or do we break it down to which women are included, which men are included? So we still have that as a discussion in the public forums for development in Kenya. Again, another opportunity we have is the establishment of climate change units in counties. Climate change is a shared responsibility between national and county governments in Kenya, in line with the Constitution. And as we talk now, some of the counties have established climate change funding functions, including, for example, Garissa and a few others. They already have this. And this is an indication that we are moving somewhere, because in these climate change units or funds, the issues of gender are being discussed at length. Next. So again, to entrench these opportunities, and I call them opportunities because they are already provided in documents, but the opportunity also arises in reviewing these documents after a certain period. So one of what Kenya has done in 2010, it came up with the National Climate Change Response Strategy, which has mentioned gender issues. Then we have the Climate Change Act of 2016 that requires the government to develop action plans to guide mainstreaming of climate change in sector functions. And most of the sectors, especially those relating to climate change, that's environment, water, energy, have put in place some mechanisms for public engagement, stakeholder engagement, and inclusion of men and women and gender mainstreaming into them. Then we have the Kenya National Climate Change Action Plan, very elaborate, which has 7 priority areas, and some the issues of gender mainstreaming and issues of exclusion by extension have been mentioned. We have the National Adaptation Plan, which we are now servicing. We have the climate.
Josephat?
Yes, please.
Josephat, sorry to interrupt, but you have 2 minutes. Please wind up.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So we have these instruments which are available and which we could go check at our own time. But important also is that Kenya adopted the Paris Agreement. And this is very clear also on the gender resources and the gender issues for our country as part of the global community. Next. So as part of the parting shot, and maybe some of the things that we may already have discussed about the ecosystem being degraded, increasing the burden of women and girls, increasing limiting opportunities and so on. And this also has extended to the current situation we are going through in Kenya, COVID 2030, about limitation of movements, which also brought in place limitation of income generating activities for both the men and women, has actually enhanced the issue of gender-based violence, which also limits the opportunity for men and women to realize their potentials. Let's move on. Let's move on because we have reflected. We are saying that measuring social exclusion is challenging due to its multidimensional nature and lack of standard data sources across countries, and for all social groups at highest risk of being left behind. Therefore, despite these limitations, what we have, the existing data allows us to do meaningful analysis of key aspects of exclusion. The report represents data while illustrating data gaps. Next, we have talked about the 2030 agenda when we started about its position on climate change, and this is a reflection for Kenya. And in conclusion, I want to use a quote again from World Health Organization 2010, that climate change adaptation strategies, and paraphrase in Kenya, need to take into account women's and men's relative and different capacities, power, social resilience, vulnerability, and resources, because gender norms, roles, and relations can either enable or constrain adaptive capabilities. Next. So thank you all of you for the opportunity to present this. Now I put back the space to our hosts and co-hosts. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Josephat, for such an elaborate presentation. Actually, what you have learned from you, and these are just my few take points, is the importance of intersectionality to unpack the identities that we have within our communities to enable us understand gender and climate change justice issues. And also social norms do limit women for adapting to climate change as well as participation in decision-making processes. I will welcome two questions, but I have two comments from the participants. One of them is Duncan Ochieng, who says that I think besides culture, it is also of importance that women undergo a change mentality as far as gender inequality is concerned. Women must start embracing fellow women. Indeed, I do agree with you, and maybe some of the speakers here can speak on that women need to lift each other to break some of the barriers that have been created, either within our own mental issues, with our own mental capabilities, as well as issues that have been created by a patriarchal society. And then Jael Bigen is commented that what is perplexing is that many countries, we have well-written and elaborate policies. And indeed, our speaker Josephat has highlighted most of them, but we fail in implementing these policies. And I'm sure that there are a lot of gender policies, there are a lot of climate change policies that actually do tackle gender and climate change justice issues, but implementation is the issue. So do we have anybody with a question or a comment before we go to our next speaker? Okay, if not, we'll move on to our next speaker. No, okay, Lydia Gatteri has commented. Okay, 3 participants have raised their hands. Who has raised their hand? Tabitha, can you let me know who has raised their hand? Tabitha, can you see who has raised their hand?
Tabi Joda.
Okay, Tabi, please speak.
Yeah, hi,
Tabi?
Mary. Yeah, hi. Good
Hello,
morning.
Tabi Joda. Hello.
Yes, I'm speaking. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Good afternoon. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Excellent. So, agenda on what you just highlighted Mary, very brilliant. Look at the influence of culture, as well as how it limits or upholds, mitigation, adaptation, climate change. But one thing I would just like you to perhaps add up a little bit, so it becomes very position where its mitigation or its adaptation processes erode our own.
Did we lose Tabby, Jordan? Did we lose Tabby? Okay, I give this opportunity to Lydia Gatteri. Lydia?
Hello?
Hi.
Hello, Lydia.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you, Josephat. What I would like to know is mostly how are you involving especially the indigenous knowledge in terms of climate change? Because sometimes as scientists, we can go ahead and do our research, and even if we are incorporating the local people around with us, but sometimes we don't incorporate that local or indigenous knowledge that they have over the years. So how are you doing that?
Can we, okay, thank you, Lydia. Can we have one more question? And then Josephat can respond. Is there anyone with their hand raised?
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Okay. Excuse me, my name is Mrs. Biliga Koivogi. I'm from République Guinea. Me is francophone. Donc, hello.
Hello.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Joseph, for the presentation. My preoccupation is on the inclusion sociale. It is my first preoccupation after vulnerability climate from the gender climate, after access and control over resources and financing climate, injustice sociale. Maintenant, my question is, the very problem Zanda is not integrated in the politics in many countries Africa. Guinée.
Est-ce que vous pouvez vous exprimer en français? Je vais vous aider à traduire, madame.
CDN Guinée.
Hello, Bilinga?
Très bien. Merci beaucoup. Très bien. Bon, j'ai un bigagi et pour faut que j'arrête. Allô?
Hello, Bilinga. We were not able to hear you clearly. Hello, Bilinga. Could you please type your question on the chat? Even if you type, just type it in French, please. Type it in French, please. Josephat, due to the time, could you please respond to the question by Lydia? And then you'll address the other ones after the conversation.
Thank you, Mary. Lydia, thank you for the question. And I think about hello, about the use of indigenous knowledge in terms in matters of gender, climate change, and exclusion.
social exclusion is being addressed by the relevant ministry and department who are implementing projects on climate change. Starting out in this is the Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Energy, Minister responsible for water, forestry, and environment. I think they have specific programs for promoting indigenous knowledge in management of climate change in terms of conservation and also adaptation, and also building resilience. So this is already being done in Kenya. Thank you so much. Lydia, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Josephat. I see there are a few participants who with their hands raised up. Please either type your question in the chat or please wait until the other two presenters have finished their presentation. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is Nyangori, Mr. Ohenjo Nyangori. Mr. Nyangori is the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Minority Rights Development, which he actually co-founded in the year 2001. He has rich experience over 20 years in policy advocacy, governance and development programs for minority and indigenous people, particularly with the community that are known as marginalized communities. And in the course of his work, he has undertaken extensive research and advocacy initiatives that have seen recognition and protection of the rights of minorities. And it has actually gained a lot of traction in Kenya. Welcome, Mr. Nyangori.
Am I?
We can hear you and we can see you. Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to do this presentation today. It's quite an interesting platform, and the topic itself is definitely also very interesting, leveraging co-benefits between social and gender justice and climate action for sustainable development. And for me, the key word here is the sustainable development. So my first slide will just basically to try and look at the concepts that are in this topic. And the first one that comes to right at the top of it, as I've mentioned, is the question of sustainable development. And when we talk of sustainable development, what of course we mean is being able to exploit our resources and develop in a way that we are also thinking about the future generations, so that they are able, we don't overexploit, we don't overuse resources, so that the future generations can also meet their needs. Within the context of achieving this, the United Nations adopted Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which is a universal call to action to end poverty, to protect the environment, the planet, and to ensure that all of us enjoy peace. One thing that is very clear in the recent past is that climate change has actually been one of the biggest causes of natural resource-based conflicts across the world. Then we have the social development goal number 5 embedded within this, that is looking at gender equality and targeting empowering all women and girls, and the SDG 7, which targets climate action and its impacts. Now, there is the centrality here of the gender equality, inclusion, and empowerment, which to a very large extent has been dealt with by the first speaker in terms of ensuring that everyone, and especially those ones that are vulnerable, are able to be effectively engaged in relevant processes. In this particular context then, what comes out is that gender equality is or becomes a matter of social justice. That is, it allows, where it's implemented, equal access to rights, to resources, and equal access to opportunities, so that nobody is actually left behind. Moving on, what then are the climate change impacts within this particular context of social and gender justice? So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has identified climate change as posing particular risks to the rights to life, food, water, health. These effects, of course, as we've already heard, they impact on women and men very differently because of the different expectations and different roles that society has imposed on men and women, which then impact on their vulnerability as well as their ability to adapt to this climate change. So gender inequality, in a sense, then contributes to deepening poverty where it's not addressed. We have situations where we've seen climate change having a very devastating effect on environment, especially natural resources and water, with adverse impacts on health and especially on livelihoods of vulnerable communities like those in the rural areas and indigenous peoples. And these very specifically or particularly because of disempowerment to women and girls. So in this particular case, we see situations where food insecurity and equal access to productive resources such as land, finances, skills, and knowledge, gender discrimination and access to decision making, then become barriers to gender inequality and undermine women's contribution to adapting to climate change in their communities. So that becomes very critical. Leveraging the core benefits between climate change and other social development goals, therefore, including gender equality and women empowerment, is thus critical to resilience. And in this particular case, we are talking within the context of, women being able to access, women and girls being able to access their rights, or being able to ensure that their rights to participate, their rights to resources are protected and respected. So potential synergies between gender equality and climate action, I think as has been mentioned, are found in energy, in agriculture, in urban development, in issues of natural areas or cases of natural disasters, as has been witnessed. It's important that women, of course, participate in climate change action as a right, not as a token. And this, of course, brings into focus then the fact that for us to address negative impacts of climate change in agriculture, in health, and other relevant sectors, there must, if we address those particular impacts by ensuring participation, which is effective, then we definitely are going to see positive impact in terms of, general quality of life across board. So the roles of women as agents of change to both drive and benefit from climate investment, we realize that have been modest. And as somebody has mentioned, we might have policies, for instance, we might have structures, but in terms of putting it into practice, there hasn't been a lot of success so far. Gender differentiated impact of climate change and safeguards is well understood. Their contributions as agents of change to scaling up climate change is often overlooked. So this is documented, yes. We have safeguards, yes. But in terms of coming to implement these safeguards, we don't see it materializing as it should. So what we're looking at is women participation and leadership in climate change is mostly unmeasured, it's mostly unnoticed, it's mostly unsupported. And these voices, unless and until, and we've come through experiences where it's assumed social inclusion is used as a word that flies around, but unless, you know, very specific targets that target women and girls, marginalized communities are identified in planning, it will be impossible to monitor how these are being achieved. So, as we note, women and girls, especially from the marginalized, indigenous, and minority communities, is, you know, have high illiteracy and poverty levels, have insecure land tenure, natural resource rights are mostly violated, poor health, lack of ways to influence development processes. So it's important that when we are dealing with programming or planning or designing activities, that we very specifically target certain groups of people and ensure intersectionality of issues being achieved. So some of the challenges, of course, that have been noted are quite a number. What we're saying is that for we to move, and I think one participant has mentioned this, that we need a paradigm shift to leverage these benefits between gender equality and climate action, where concerns and voice of women and girls will be placed at the center of climate action. Now, some challenges, of course, manifest themselves in the gap between policy and practice, inadequate awareness of local and community levels among civil servants. To date, many people who work in government are asking about who are marginalized communities. It's not their mistake. I mean, these are nomenclatures that have come into being part of our legal system, but then the skills and capacity to interpret them are still lacking. Weak capacity of women and girls to engage across board, and the lack of well-organized voices, networking among the particular groups to engage with the duty bearers for effective implementation of policies and programs that have been designed. So existence of top-down development and governance structures and approaches would be critical, especially in making climate finance gender responsive. And these in the context, especially of indigenous peoples and minorities, concerns are already emerging that we might not end up meeting the target of social development goal number 5, and this is worrying, and that means that we really need to step up, because the projections are actually like gender parity in politics will probably be achieved in 50 years from now. And remember, in Kenya, we're already having a very emotive conversation around this issue. And closing the gender gap in economic participation and opportunity is being targeted at 81 years. So these are conversations that we probably would need to have serious deliberations about, especially when it comes to issues around budgeting in Kenya, to be able to see how we can be able to leverage and support better economic participation and opportunity models for women and girls. As I've said, this is not very interesting, especially for people from minority and indigenous communities in the country.
Hi, Nyang'ori. Sorry for interrupting you, but I wish to let you know that you only have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. And these are the recommendations, which is actually the last slide. Thanks for the reminder. one of the recommendations that I would suggest is that national adaptation programs of action should be guided by gender equality. Right now, we just have rhetoric. Should be guided by gender equality on, as per the resolutions of COP7 in Marrakech, with particular focus on indigenous communities. We need to promote the goal of gender balance in bodies. And it's not just a question of, and I think this is where sometimes we go wrong. It's not just a question of representation of men and women. Sometimes it's a question about what kind of skills are those people who are coming on board have in terms of gender issues and rights, so that they can then be able to make quality, they can make quality contributions. So it's not about numbers, it's about the quality also. So both numbers and quality need to be taken into consideration here. Address the gender differentiated, gender differentiated investment risks in energy to ensure realization of potential to accelerate universal energy access. A recent research indicates that among indigenous peoples, about biomass, charcoal and firewood. You can imagine how that is impacting in terms of health, the kind of poverty situations. And by the end of the day, biomass is actually more expensive than clean energy. So we need to look into how we can be able to support better energy use for people, especially at the lower levels of income. Empower women as women as household energy managers to become agents of change, and facilitate women producers access to finance so that they can be able to invest in climate resilient and time-saving assets. Facilitate informed and effective engagement between duty bearers and communities. Facilitate and develop capacities of women, girls, women, and boys, and awareness creation, especially among minority and indigenous peoples around this whole issue of gender justice. Provide space for integration of indigenous traditional knowledge in gender-based development agenda and climate change action. And finally, adopt a gender-based development and climate change action alive to local cultural realities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nyang'ori, for that insightful presentation. Indeed, it has covered quite well the rights of minorities in gender and climate justice. So at this juncture, I wish to welcome the questions. We will only be taking 2 questions for Nyang'ori, and I request that you continue posting your questions as well via the chat. So anyone that would like to contribute or ask a question, please raise your hand so that Nyang'ori can answer it. Thank you. Okay, as we wait for the questions, there's a comment that has been posted via chat, and it says, indeed, gender equality is achievable only if we do more capacity building on the need to have varied voices, especially in legal policy. Okay, I can see John Mary has raised his hand. John, please make your contribution.
Okay,
John Mary, please.
Mary from Uganda. And I'd like to thank. Are we together?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm John Mary from Uganda, and thank you for the presentation. I'd like to say that I think we still have a problem.
Sorry, John, there seems to be some noise on your background, so we can't hear you.
Okay. Actually, can you hear me now?
You're still faint.
I'll take quickly. Oh. Okay. Even now?
Unfortunately, there's still noise on the background.
Let me try one.
Yes, you can type via the chat.
I could be somebody else.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, no, I was just saying that I think we still need to do some work around empowering women, because when you look at the role of men in homes, this doesn't seem to be changing at all in our East Africa. For example, in Uganda, man is a man. A man controls all the resources.
Unfortunately, John, we can't still hear you. Please type your contribution via the chat box. Hello? Okay, it seems that we've lost John. But
sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. You can go ahead. We can hear you now.
Okay, I don't know that you have. I think that take a very strong. They need to be given space to do any work in issues of climate. Short of this, we shall continue to have men dominating, and men, I think, make a lot of mistakes. I'll just look at it. That's around Lake Victoria. Most factories, most of the houses which are polluting.
Okay, John, please type your contribution via the chat. We have lost you completely. So as John types his contribution, there's a contribution by Cynthia, and she says the problem of gender equality is becoming fairly achievable due to tradition and men egocentric nature. There is need to build men's capacity on this issue. So that is what has been posted via the chat, and I will kindly request Nyangori to make a voice or to make a voice on those two comments, and then we can move to the next presenter.
Okay, I was seeing Duncan Ching's hand also up, but I hope he had already spoken. However, as you've noted, I can also see some comment from Michael Tiampati. There's need to plow back commensurate in terms of minorities IDPs contributions to GDP in order to address challenges of empowerment. Now, one of the critical issues that is coming from all these comments is the question of capacity, the capacity building for both men and women, so that we can be able to be alive to and appreciate the issues around gender justice, which is basically around access to rights for both men and women, and especially for women in this particular sense. Now, one critical factor going forward is that there's been very limited budgets allocated for this. Just what talked about processes like the National Climate Change Action Plan. But then when you look at them, we do not have issues disaggregated intersectionally, intersectionally, in the sense that by the end of the time, what we have on paper is never, never comes out in practice. I was looking the other day at the climate change regulations, and again, we have not disaggregated how that fund will be used and how marginalized communities or marginalized groups of people like women would be supported to access that funding for climate change action. So there's need to turn that policy into practice in a way that is practically beneficial. I think we, as has been mentioned, we are having a lot of rhetoric, we are having a lot of documentations, a lot of research, but we are having very, very, very little in terms of putting in place structures and systems that would then go a long way in implementing what we put on paper. I think that is what I would say in response to the comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Nyang'ori, for that comment. Duncan's hand was up. Please, Duncan, hold on to your comment or your question, and then you can ask after the next presentation. So at this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to welcome Nancy Marango. Nancy Marango is our next presenter, and she's a communication and public policy analyst, and is passionate to advocate for climate mainstreaming for persons with disability. She envisions a facilitative infrastructure that supports people with disabilities to be climate adaptive. She currently serves at the Chemichemi Foundation as the executive director. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Faith, for the introduction. And as a way of introduction, I would like to agree with the previous presenter that issues of gender are pertinent when we come to have conversations around climate. And when we look at persons with disabilities, they are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. This is because, number one, adverse weather conditions affect them differently. Most of them need assistive devices, and they need much more support than any other group or category of gender for them to be able to be climate resilient. And what has been the main challenge on dealing with issues, disability and climate? Number one, there is lack of information and research, because I was having a look at the National Climate Change Policy. What it has, it's a general statement. We include, yes, gender and the marginalized, but what is the specific action that needs to be effected, or what is the specific action that needs to be done for the persons with disabilities? And how then do we define climate injustice for persons with disabilities? What are some of the issues that affect them? Number one, there is the vulnerability to natural hazards within rural households in Kenya. This is mainly fueled by poverty. I will take, for example, for a group in Meru County, in Chiro. This is an area where it is very agricultural rich, but because now, number one, due to water scarcity, they don't even have like a tank to store water, and they have to travel for a long distance to fetch the water. How can they be assisted and brought on board if the national policy itself does not say the existing Meru County action, the Meru County Climate Change Act does not make a specific provision for them. Secondly, we have political factors that also affect persons with disabilities because of political invisibility, because of lack of national social and political inclusion, whereby, yes, the law again is very general. It does not say if I am in Kakamega County and I belong to this self-help group of persons with disabilities, I am supposed to be provided for assistive devices, and all responsibility is left to the National Council of Persons with Disabilities. Yes, they have a national level to provide the assistive devices, but within our areas of environmental conservation, within our jurisdiction of climate resilience, what is it that we ought to do for them? Then the other thing that propels climate injustice for persons with disabilities is lack of documented county-specific policies. I believe I've already expounded on that. And for me, this is a call to action. Yes, it is there. How many of these documents have been translated into Braille? How many of these documents have been translated into sign language? Or is it that we've taken a very well done policy, a very good documented acts, we've put it for our shelves for ourselves, and we've forgotten that there is someone who is blind somewhere, there is someone who is deaf somewhere, and yet they still need to access this information. Then fourthly, is that majority of persons with disabilities in rural households have been consistently sidelined in climate resilience and development plans. For example, I will pose a question to Jackson from the Ministry of Gender. How many of their action plans or their documentations, again, are available in other readable forms? And if we are able to bridge the existing gap, number one, just the simple documentation and availability of information. Number two, do research and say, this is the number of persons with disabilities in these different counties. We are able, again, to be informed by the recommendations of these research findings to be able to come up with specific action-oriented solutions for them. And a rhetorical question will be, who is to blame? I believe there is no one to blame, because all at the national level, at the county level, we have made a significant efforts to bring the persons with disability, to bring the climate resilient conversations on board. However, yes, 16 counties, namely Vihiga, Kakamega, Busia, Siaya, Elgeyo Marakwet, Makueni, Kitui, Isiolo, Garissa, Wajir, Nyamira, Kisii, Kisumu, Busia, Nakuru, Bomet. They all have enacted climate change acts and policies. But the good question is, are these documents translated into other readable formats and forms? And do the groups of persons living in disabilities within these 16 counties, do they know that such policies exist? Therefore, what will be the intersection? Number one, there is need to provide technical support. That is number one. The assistive devices. I cannot go and tell a deaf person, you need to mainstream your climate change action. Number one, plant trees, grow fruit trees, or have a catchment water area when they don't have a hearing aid. That will not be possible. Or if they don't have a translator. For the blind, if they don't have a white cane, it will not be possible for them to be able to move. And if someone is physically challenged without a wheelchair, again, it is impossible for them to be able to be brought to the table. Secondly, there is the involvement in policy formulation and implementation. I am not very sure that every time we are developing our national and county policies, we bring the people from the rural households with disabilities on the table to ask them, what are your challenges? What do you need to be done? Or we just randomly say, this will work for all of us. And I think not unless we get to that point that we will say, the person with a disability can also be brought on the table and give an idea. That is the time we will be able to create the intersection. Then thirdly, as it has been it has been emphasized there is need to train, empower, enlighten, and enable. This is because the Kenya Climate Act itself requires that the government establishes accredited training programs on climate change. And persons with disabilities, I believe, they need to have a stake on the training programs. Then the Act further provides for research on climate change and collation and dissemination of information. If we are able to have persons with disabilities on these forums, it will be better and possible for us to create the intersection. And lastly, there is education that is on emerging technologies. You realize that most persons with disabilities are not able to access devices like computers. Yes, they may be having smartphones, but they don't have access to data. That brings a form of marginalization for them, because if they cannot access an online course on climate change, they will not be able to know what exactly is happening in the global world. And how can then technology be an enabler for intersection for climate resilience for persons with disabilities? Number one, big data can provide the processing and the connecting of large volumes of data. This implies that at the county level, we need to go and do research, find these people, come up with a good questionnaire, and allow actually the youth with disabilities to be the ones to carry out this research under guidance. Then secondly, there is artificial intelligence. That is, it performs the calculations and makes the predictions and takes decisions to mitigate the impact of climate change. Therefore, if we are able to get the data sets, we will be able to use artificial intelligence to develop the thematic needs that need to be addressed for persons with disabilities. Then, perfectly, cloud computing will provide the storage while mitigating the carbon footprints that come with a lot of saving the storage devices. So what do we do at Chemi Foundation? We've tried to equip communities to build a resilient society, and we are trying to create an intersection. But by and large, as much as we are trying to break down and bring the persons with disabilities on the table, we have had a big challenge whereby there is a lack of willingness and support to provide reports and information to translate them into other readable formats for them to be disseminated. For persons with disabilities to have access. And for me, this will be a call to action at the national level and the different ministries that have these reports and have this information to be able to share willingly. For us, we can translate at our own cost and disseminate in collaboration. Then, as we conclude, I would like to say that when persons with disabilities issues are mentioned in discussions of climate change, it is usually with a reference to their vulnerability. But a point has come whereby we have to stop looking at persons with disabilities as victims, but we have to look at them as agents capable of contributing to solutions. Last week, I had a conversation with Dr. Mbugwa from Kenyatta University, and he was telling me that one of his students is an ICT guru, and he posed a challenge to me. He asked me, Nancy, if we identified a group of youth who are physically disabled, provided like laptops for them or iPads, and trained them on how to access online courses, on online learning modules, or someone to train them on programming, these students will excel very well. But not unless we reach a middle point whereby all of us are able to say, I will support a computer, I will support an iPad, we will still remain at the same level whereby we say it is the responsibility of the National Councils of Peoples with Disabilities to deal with the groups that we always refer to as marginalized. Then secondly, in conclusion, and lastly, we all have to see it differently and realize that if we can adapt training, education, capacity building, and policy formulation that are inclusive, we will be able to bring and bridge the gap that our children, our brothers and sisters with disabilities have, and be able to create an intersection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for that amazing presentation. Indeed, we all have a role to ensure that we hold the hands of people living with disability in this journey of climate change so that we can work together and also achieve gender and climate justice. So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to welcome any questions or comments to Nancy, so that we can move to the next chapter. You're most welcome for any comments. And as we wait for the questions and people to raise their hands, I would like to open this session by reading a comment by Michael Tiampati. And he says, among such communities as nomadic pastoralists, PWDs especially face multiple climate change, such as ecological degradation, loss of livelihoods and production systems, and resource-based conflicts, and cattle rustling in a bid to restock after drought evidence. And then also there is another comment by Cynthia Buluibieri, and she says, until we shun discrimination, the people with disabilities, until we shun discriminating the people with disabilities and accept them in society as every other normal person, by equipping them as others, they will be withdrawn from the society.
That's very true.
All right, so any hands, please?
Duncan, hands is up.
All right, thank you very much. Duncan Ochieng, you're welcome to make your contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a question to the previous, not a question, but a comment on gender equality as concerning climate change. And from the discussion, what is of clarity is that too much tokenism has made, let me say, the female gender to feel less advantaged. I envisaged a situation where we just level the ground, and when it is policy framework making, we involve them with no advantage or disadvantage to the other. I think in this will at least spur this discussion on gender equality. Then to Nancy, on people living with disability, I think sometimes is still on us. We still go back to that capacity building we talked about. A lot of sensitization has to be done because we have extreme culture. And in most of our communities, you find that we go to an extent of some people hiding these people living with disability. So there's no way they will come to the table or their voices will be heard on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan. Yes, Nancy?
Yes, I agree with Duncan totally. And this is a conversation I've been having with one Lucy Mobi. She's a focus and liaison person in Kakamega. And I keep telling her that a point of intersection has to be reached whereby we need to hear them speak for themselves and not us speaking for them. And one of the challenges we are having with that group is that we are looking for computers, at least to facilitate their learning. That is one way of building their capacity. And I believe this is a forum where I will extend that request. If anyone of you is willing to donate computers and a printer, we will appreciate your support so that they can be taken down to Kakamega to benefit that group. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And as we come to the end of that session, I would like to read two comments that have been posted via the chat. One is by John Mary. He says climate change is a matter of civil rights. And he also goes ahead to say that thanks for the presentations. Both women and people living with disabilities are discriminated and face a lot of injustice in climate interventions. There's another comment by, okay, it's a request by Faluk. And Faluk, I would like to confirm that the presentations will be shared to everyone. We also have a comment by Biliga, and the comment is in French. Unfortunately, Biliga, at the moment, we don't have a French translator. We will try and organize for that next time. However, your question will be answered directly to you. At this point, dear participants, I wish to welcome our presenters for the day to make a 1 minute final comment as we close. I'll start with Josephat. Josephat, please, are you around?
I'm around.
All right, 1 minute to make a comment.
Okay, thank you, ICCASA. Thank you for the foundation.
Hello, Josephat, your voice seems to have disappeared. We can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. My comment, final comment is that, as I said in closing remarks, the last part of my presentation is that we still have huge opportunities in Kenya. One of them is that we already have this document in place, and the greatest opportunity we have is that every one of these documents has a review period or a shelf life upon which we can influence those reviews and integrate the issues of climate justice, gender justice, and the issues of social exclusion. And a lot of effort is already being made. I know last year there was the looking at the nationally determined contributions on climate change from a gender lens, and there's a report to that effect. So the political commitment is in existence, and we also have institutional frameworks which we can continue influencing to capture the emerging issues. I know we have policy processes, reviewing of the current policies and the existing policies, but we are also increasingly putting in place spaces for stakeholder engagement and further breaking down the stakeholders to the subcategories that need to participate, and those whose voice must be placed at a place of glory in terms of what we need to do in climate change, whether the agenda or the issues of disability, minorities and marginalized, and so on. So I know we are doing well as a country. Thank you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Josephat. I seem to have skipped the one point, which we will go back to, and then I will allow the rest of the presenters to speak once we are done. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the conversation is open. If you have any contribution to make on this, I will allow 4 contributions, and also request that we give a little extension to the dialogue so that we are all able to make a contribution and dialogue about gender and climate justice. Thank you.
Aloysius' hand is up.
Aloysius, I can see your hand is up.
Yes.
You're open to contribute to the dialogue.
Yes, just a comment from the last presentation from Nancy Marango, that just to add something is we need to improve the capacity for the people living with disabilities, especially on their self-confidence, so that they can also try to have confidence to depend and believe that they can by themselves. Because in my interaction with the communities, that
Aloysius, we seem to have lost you.
has been the challenge. That even as much as independent, then you also need to have fish. We now go to the sustainable. Am I there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So my last point.
Hello, Aloysius, we seem to have lost you. Could you please type via the chat?
About the sustainable projects, we have them in the now when a certain able to. Otherwise, I pray. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Dr. George, your hand is up. You're welcome to the dialogue.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd like to ask, especially when you involve the people living with a disability in matters as far as climate is concerned, we realize that there is little participation. Even in this conference, if we ask a question, how many of those people are we involving? We can find out that there are none or there are few. So the discussion should start even with us. When we organize for such conferences, let us involve as much people as possible in this forum, and also in organizations that discuss climate issues. Let us also involve them in terms of employing those who have disability, so that the conversation can be fruitful, not only involving them in awareness creation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll give an opportunity to two more hands that I can see, Cynthia and Anne. Cynthia, you can start by making your contribution to the dialogue.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be here. What I want to say, I want to appreciate Nancy for talking about the disabled. The truth is, in society, they are not recognized. And I'm very sure it's because of their disability. So like what my brother just said, they need to be inclusive. And while we are including the disabled, we should also think about the widows who have been marginalized because of culture and tradition. Sometimes the widows are not placed in society. We need to build the capacities of the widows. We need to build the capacities of the disabled. There are some that are already withdrawn in the society, all because they are not educated. We need to encourage these people. And one more thing that I need to say is, we've been fighting about this climate justice, gender and climate injustice, gender and climate justice. We have put in so much effort. We just need to continue to raise our voices and continue to do what is right. And I want to believe that someday we will get there. Thank you.
Indeed, someday we will get there. This is a part of the journey that we are walking, and we are very hopeful that we will achieve. Anne, please make your contribution to the dialogue.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to attend this conference. And I want to thank all the presenters for their wonderful presentations. I made a comment on the chat, but somehow like you didn't see. So I was saying climate change and gender are inseparable. They are part and parcel. And the challenge for me, I see when you relate climate change to gender is financing, because whatever activity or action that has to be made in line with climate change requires some kind of financing at whatever level, from grassroots, from national, from international, and all those, they require some kind of financing. So I'm just wondering how that is being done in Kenya, for example. I will discuss with John Mary for Uganda, how that is being done, how the women, for example, maybe, and girls can have access to financing. Like we have already seen here, we are saying women don't have access and control to things like land, which you could use as a collateral to access financing. Then to Nancy about the PWs, for example, what we do with my groups and communities, the disabled, you find most of them don't even have the proper education because they are left out. So what we do with them, we engage them in the nurseries. They can do potting, weeding, pricking, and then for the blind, we engage them in things to do with like sensitization. They can do poems. So those are some of the ways that we do to engage those PWs. But like she rightly said, there is need to have them engaged and involved at all levels. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, and for sharing your experience from Uganda. And finally, I would like to give this opportunity to Leoneta. Once Leoneta is done, because of time, we seem to have ran out of time. I request that Nancy answers to the questions that have been raised, then Nyang'ori, and finally we will have first closing for us. Thank you. Leoneta, please. Okay, we seem to have lost Leoneta. So at this point, dear participants, I wish to welcome Nancy to answer to the questions that have been asked. And then after this, after Nancy, I request Nyang'ori to answer to the questions that have been raised and contribute to the final leg of the dialogue. Welcome, Nancy. Nancy?
Yes, please, sorry for that.
All right.
Let me unmute, sorry for that. Kindly, Faith, just repeat the question.
Okay, there is Anne has commented on how they engage people living with disability in Uganda, and also there was a contribution by Cynthia. So basically, it's for you to make the final comment on the dialogue and involving people living with disability to ensure that there is climate justice on their end.
Yes, I heard what Anne and Cynthia said, and when she spoke about the sporting and the poems, that is actually tapping into their creative arts space. We are in the process also of trying to identify partners and collaborators who can go to schools and mentor, train, and encourage students living with disabilities. Last week, I was talking to a football coach who trains Leicester University students, and I was asking him if it is possible for him to work, for example, with Joytown School, which is here in Nairobi in Thika. And he said he will not mind, provided that we are able to get the consent from the school. So what she said, it is right, because at the end of the day, especially for the children and youth, they need to be involved in co-curricular activities so that they feel they are at par with the other children and they are not excluded. And at the end of the day, the intersection between climate, persons with disabilities, in my opinion, is the responsibility of all of us, because personal branding, self-confidence, it is Faith, it is Nancy, it is Mary, it is Edna, it is Dr. Aoko's responsibility, in my opinion, to be able to say, I live in this community, I have identified these students, this youth, these young men, these young children, they have disabilities, and I say, instead of going to watch my favorite football game, or instead of going out to hang out with my girls, I will take that afternoon and train these children and this youth on being confident, on personal branding, on how to write their CVs. That is the only way we will bring, especially the youth and the children, on board. This cannot be left to the Ministry of Gender alone. It cannot be left to the Ministry of Agriculture alone, but everyone has to take a responsibility. And in conclusion, I would like to appreciate the conveners of this session for giving us the opportunity to share our insights. And we are happy that, especially in Kenya, the government is doing much more in fostering inclusion. Having policy itself in place, to me, is a good step ahead, because now we are talking when we have something. And one thing I would want to note is that the Tharaka-Nithi County has a climate fund. Someone commented about access to finance, and the Tharaka-Nithi County has a fund. It's only that I do not know how it operates. And when also I looked at the list of participants of this forum, I have seen someone from the National Treasury, and I will be happy to engage them to know what exactly they're doing at the National Treasury in regards to climate change, and if there is any specific funds for persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Nyangori, please, 1 minute.
Thanks, Faith. I don't think I'll spend a lot of time. My very first comment, I think all of us are agreeing that gender justice is critical to attaining climate justice. One of the issues that we need to really look into is the Climate Change Act 2016 and the subsequent climate change fund regulations. Kenya, I think, was the first country in Africa to develop that legislation. It's a pace-setting legislation, but most importantly, it does not provide for disaggregation of the very special interest groups like women, like minorities, indigenous peoples. This is only elaborated at the Climate Change Council, but within the structure, within the body of the Act, I think it's assumed, or probably because of lack of proper engagement, it was completely missed out in terms, and it therefore becomes a challenge for some of these special interest groups to then interact and work with it. So that's an area that needs urgent attention. And to go with that, I think the other issue, as we've mentioned, is practically the whole question about capacitating these groups to be able to engage, ensuring that their voices are being heard. I think that is central to achieving any targets for, you know, ensuring we achieve social justice across board. Many members of these groups across the country are yet to understand their situations in very practical terms. They're yet to grasp, you know, the opportunities around them that they could easily leverage. I think the conversation has remained in a way technical and to a very big extent elitist, if I may use that word. I think we need activities, we need programs, we need initiatives that would empower the particular groups of people that we're talking about, so that they're able to claim their rights in whatever spaces that they exist in, because everything cannot be done from a centralized position. And the bigger voice that we have, the better for everyone. One critical issue here is that there's political goodwill within the country.
Nyang'ori, you seem to have exhausted your 1 minute.
Okay.
Yes.
Just in conclusion, I was saying that there's political goodwill. And finally, thanks to Friedrich-Ebert and ICCASA for the opportunity. Thanks, thanks, Faith.
Okay, thank you very much. Finally, Friedrich-Ebert, the person that is representing, please make your comment, and thank you for making this dialogue happen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Faith. And let me also take this opportunity in the next 1-2 minutes to thank the participants for the great conversation, indeed, touching on various issues. One, around the policy and also the practical aspects, and more so on the intersectionality between climate justice and gender justice. I think the discussion also moved further in terms of the engagement in the policy aspects around the climate change negotiations and how we can enhance active women participation and engagement in the policy discussions. How we bring in the issues of persons living with disabilities, the issues of also around financing. And I think climate financing is very important, and great to see that the next conversation or dialogue that ICCASA is organizing is focusing on climate finance. I think that's quite interesting around the green climate finance. Then I think moving forward, we will contextualize or bring together the different perspectives from other participants together with ICCASA. Then we see what kind of direction we'll take with this conversation. As I said, we're also looking at the different sectors on how to bring in the gender justice aspect within the sectors that are highly affected by climate change. And based on the discussions today, and the other work that we're doing, it will help us in trying to frame the next conversation or the next series of our discussions. Thanks a lot to the panelists. I think those were very great insights, and we look forward to engaging with you in the next conversations. Thanks, ICCASA. You did a lot of work in organizing this, and thanks for the quality output in this particular discussion. So let me stop there and look forward to seeing you in the next dialogue. Thank you.
And with that, dear participants, we come to the end of this dialogue on gender and climate justice in Kenya. This was the first series this was the first one in the series that will be running. We will keep you updated on what is happening next, or the next dialogue. And this conversation will be uploaded to the ICCASA YouTube channel and Facebook page, and also to the Friedrich-Ebert social media pages. So you can access it from there. I can also see there's a link that has been shared with the presentation, so you can access it via the chat. And our next conversation will be on August 17th starting from 3 p.m. That is East African time. And our speaker will be Ms. Tilope Ngozi Akosa from Nigeria. And Titilope is a legal practitioner and coordinator of the Center for 21st Century Issues in Nigeria. So dear participants and our panelists, I wish you a good evening, a good morning, and a good afternoon to you all. Thank you and bye.
Thank you very much.